This is the most important piece of movement tech in all of Titanfall 2. It is the primary method for gaining speed, and thus speedrunners and advanced players are intimately familiar with it. The problem is, no one actually understands how they work. But I do, and within the next, I don't know, like 25 minutes, I'll tell you all about how I figured out exactly what makes the Wallkick tick under the hood. Welcome to my Wallkick PhD, I guess. To get everyone on the same page about what exactly it is that we're talking about, a wallkick is generally considered to be an instant jump from a wall where you're approaching it with some already built up speed and gaining more speed off of that wall jump. Now, a wallkick isn't a single mechanic, but rather an emergent behavior from the interaction of multiple different mechanics. Because of this, it doesn't really have a super precise definition, and instead is a know it when you see it kind of thing. Like, this is a wallkick, this is not a wallkick, and this we would call a missed wallkick. Now, previously, whenever we've looked at a mechanic on this channel, we've often had the luxury of having access to some level of relevant source code that we could point to or look at to build an understanding. This time, we don't really have that, so we're gonna need a different approach. We will be cosplaying as scientists. We will conduct a study, collect a bunch of data, and then analyze it. Poorly. Just so we don't have to start fully from scratch though, we can start by taking a look at what knowledge already exists and has been passed on to new speedrunners in the form of movement tutorials.
Wall kicks are basically when you approach the wall, if you jump off within, I believe it's a 3-frame window. A wall kick is when you jump from a wall within 5 frames or less. It depends on the angle at which you approach the wall, and of course the speed at which you jump from the wall itself. The angle you're facing as you jump plays a large role too, as it directly influences where you're traveling immediately following the jump itself.
So the main thing we'll want to look at, and what we're solving for, so to speak, is the speed gain. And these tutorials have already given us a few parameters that the speed gain is supposedly dependent on, that being the timing of the jump input, or the number of frames spent on the wall, the incoming angle, and the look direction during the wall jump. Two things that aren't mentioned in here that I'll still add as parameters are the incoming speed and the input direction. Now, an important question is, how are we even going to collect all that data? Turns out, these values are all either directly accessible or calculable by running a custom script and calling the game's own functions, like getVelocity, getOrigin, and iAngles. Thanks to a lot of work done by Elad, one of the main people behind the development of the Ronin speedrun client, it's also possible to save all of these values to a text file, which lets us then transfer that data into other tools to help us make sense of all those numbers. Let's consider the frame before making contact with the wall, every frame where the player is contacting the wall, and the first frame after leaving the wall. We can get the speed gain by extracting the velocity vectors from the pre- and post-wall run frames, calculating their lengths, and then taking the difference between those two. This also gives us the incoming speed and the timing we can get from simply counting up all the wall frames. For the incoming angle, we can calculate the angle between the velocity vectors from the pre-wall run frame and the first wall contact frame, which we do with this formula. So we have the dot product of both vectors divided by the product of both of their lengths, and then take the inverse cosine of the whole thing. Sure. But we can actually do the same thing with both the look direction and input direction. So now that we have all our parameters in place, let's collect some data. So we've got some numbers. So that's exciting. I mean, it's not terribly exciting right off the bat, but now that we have these numbers, we can start visualizing these in some pretty interesting ways. I have to do this back on the computer. I don't know why I printed these out, that's not. The simplest thing we can do is to look at just the speed gain values first. Simply arranging them from left to right in no particular order looks like this. We could sort them in ascending order to get something like this, or even group them together and arrange them by frequency, which gives us this shape that vaguely resembles a normal distribution. Everything above the 0 line here is a successful wall kick, and everything below is a missed wall kick. This all looks kinda neat, but it doesn't actually tell us all that much aside from confirming what you and I were probably assuming, and that the speed gain from a wall kick isn't purely random. If it was, then this view would look like uniform noise, this would be a straight line, and this distribution would be flat. The real interesting stuff should be hiding in all of these other numbers, because now we want to start answering the question of if, and more importantly how, all of these affect the speed gain. So let's take a look at the timing first. If we put the speed gain on the y-axis and the number of wall frames on the x-axis, we get a blob like this. Because we have so many points, a lot of these are overlapping at the moment, so if we increase the visual size of the dots where we have the highest density, our blob starts to get a more visible shape. If we now plot the average speed gain value for each frame onto a line, that line hits 0 around frame 4, which actually roughly aligns with the threshold that's mentioned in those tutorials that we looked at earlier, so it definitely looks like we're onto something here. Although, given how noisy this blob is, this is clearly not the whole story, so let's go through all the other parameters we have and see if we can spot similar patterns. Putting the speed gain against the angle gives us a blob like this. This one seems to have an even stronger correlation where as the angle increases, the speed delta rapidly decreases. And the incoming speed looks like this. This one also has a downward trend with what even looks like a hard wall where practically no Wallkick falls anywhere in this area. Each one of these still has a lot of noise though, but we should be able to mitigate this by simply stepping up one dimension to look at more than one parameter at a time. Now this is starting to look a lot more promising. Here we've got speed gain on the z-axis, wall frames on the x-axis, and incoming angle on the y-axis. From this perspective, it's a lot easier to see where the vast majority of Wallkicks end up, and we can even explain a lot of data points that previously looked like outliers. This group, for example, shows a big speed loss despite the Wallkick happening on the first and second possible frame. But shifting our perspective, we can now see that this big speed loss is explained by the incoming angle being very close to 90 degrees. Same thing with these ones right here. Despite the near perfect angle, these still show a lot of speed loss, but looking at the original perspective again, they pair with a longer time spent on the wall. What's a bit harder to explain is this batch of outliers up here, where the speed gain is extremely high, despite also having high wall frames. Unfortunately, adding a fourth spatial dimension is not the most practical way to extend this graph, so instead, to include the incoming speed into this graph, we're going to use color. And with that, we can actually explain these points up here. These seemingly had such a low incoming speed that entering the wall run didn't actually lose much, if any speed at all. And even generally, as the incoming speed increases, the outgoing speed gain goes down, which confirms what we were seeing in this view. Another fun thing we can do with this new parameter is filter the points we can see instead of coloring them. As we go from low to high incoming speed and back, we can see how everything starts to shift, almost rotating around this point at 0 wall frames and 0 incoming angle. And this makes intuitive sense to me. A theoretical perfect Wallkick would not be affected by any kind of wall friction or any other form of speed loss, and we should expect to get the same speed boost every single time. But that does beg the question, what actually is a perfect Wallkick? To answer this question, we need to go a little bit deeper into the actual mechanics of the Wallkick, because here's the thing about the data we've been looking at. It's honestly not very useful beyond getting an overview of which parameters are likely to play a big role and which aren't. These numbers really just represent a bunch of aimless Wallkicks where I effectively let human error do the random sampling for me, which is honestly a more likely cause for this normal distribution than anything else, because my own pre-existing muscle memory and tendency to hit good Wallkicks inherently skews the data to show a very heavy bias towards these values of low wall frames, shallow incoming angle, and the view and input direction pointing near parallel to the wall. So if we want to figure out exactly how Wallkicks come together, we need to be a bit more rigorous and treat them not like a single mechanic, but break them down into their individual components and investigate those. So any Wallkick can be effectively split into 3 individual components. That being the initial wall contact, the wall run, and the wall jump. This is the wall. So for the initial wall contact, we only really care about the first 2 frames, that's V0 and V1. So instead of what we have been doing, which is taking the speed delta between the first and last frame, that's Vn, what we can do is we can take the speed delta between the first 2 frames. And additionally, what we can do is to get the impulse that gets us in line with the wall, we can take the velocity vector from the second frame and from that subtract the vector of the first frame. To get the cleanest possible results, we need to also look at each parameter individually. So if we look at what the incoming angle does, we'll want to vary only that and keep the incoming speed, look direction, and input direction all at a fixed value, and vice versa when isolating those. Oh, that means I need to collect more data. Oh no, I need to do my job. Now this is a lot more like it. This here is our speed delta against the incoming angle. You know, it's really nice having such a clear line instead of a big noisy blob for once. Another nice thing we can see here, since we collected the exact impulse, is that all of them fall onto this line, which means they all point in the same direction, that being the direction of the wall normal. The eagle-eyed among you might already be looking at this graph and find that it looks eerily similar to the top half of a cosine wave. If you've noticed this, you've basically already figured out a big clue as to how Titanfall handles wall collisions, but we'll get to that in due time, don't worry. For now, just keep that in the back of your mind. Here we have our speed delta against the incoming speed. This is a pretty clear linear correlation where coming at a wall with a higher speed will result in more speed being lost. The two parameters that showed no correlation were the look direction and input direction. At most, the look direction shows a deviation of about half a unit of speed centered around the expected value, but there's no pattern to this, so it's safe to ignore given how tiny it is. I mean, just to give you an idea, this is what half a unit of speed looks like in-game. The input angle looks like it has a pattern to it at first glance, but because the input direction can directly affect the player velocity vector, it was a bit harder to eliminate all possible variables. If we put the velocity's angle back into this graph, we can actually see how this is what correlates and not the actual input direction. So we were able to confirm that the initial speed loss from contacting the wall is proportional to both the incoming angle and incoming speed, and that the look and input direction have no effect on our speed delta. Component number 2 is the wall run, which encompasses every frame except for the first and last frame. So the velocities go from v1 to vn-1. Now, since we're no longer looking at the first frame as a whole, one parameter we can already cross out is the incoming angle. And similarly, since we're no longer looking at the incoming speed from the first frame, we want to look at the speed from the first wall run frame. So instead of v0, we're looking at v1. Now, one thing that's already apparent from just playing around with the wall run is that the game has a sort of goal speed of 340 units that it either accelerates or decelerates you towards, depending if you're already above or below that speed. Here are a few lines that show us what that looks like at varying starting speeds. Within a speedrunning context, the only truly relevant lines here are the ones below the 0 line, and I would consider everything above to be outside of the territory of what we would usually consider a wall kick, since it triggers wall acceleration and not wall friction. Investigating wall mechanics as a whole would also require us to reverse engineer the game's binaries, which... Now this is the speed delta, but we can also look at the overall speed by offsetting the curves vertically by their starting speed, which shows us that all of these curves actually look pretty similar to each other. If we now shift the curves horizontally so that their y values align, the whole curve overlaps almost perfectly, as if each starting speed just shows us a different part of the same curve. This is another important clue as to how wall friction is implemented, so just keep that in the back of your mind along with this cosine wave. So the starting speed determines the initial steepness of this wall friction curve, but let's see if the other parameters do something to this curve as well. Here's what I have on look direction. Looks pretty much like the same curve stacked on top of itself 12 times, so I think we can rule out that look direction does anything. But what does have an impact is the input direction. I found that instead of a continuous relationship between the input angle and wall run speed, there's a grouping where a certain range of angles will result in the same behavior. In particular, there's 4 behaviors resulting from these 4 angle ranges, each covering 90 degrees. An input pointed forward results in this familiar shape, where wall friction slows us down until we hit a speed of 340 units, at which point we stay at that speed. Pointing it away from the wall results in the wall run ending instantly. Pointing it into the wall or holding neutral results in wall friction taking our speed all the way to 0, and pointing it backwards slows us down faster than normal and then starts accelerating us in the opposite direction. Any deviations within those ranges don't do anything beyond this, except for the vertical angle, which results in the horizontal wall run speed being lower when pointed up or down. But since this only really takes effect way after you would usually jump off if you were going for a wall kick, I think we can choose to ignore this for now and move on to the last component. The final component of the wall kick is the wall jump, of which we can get the impulse vector by simply subtracting the velocity vector from the second to last frame from that of the last frame. It also makes sense to adjust our parameters again, since we no longer really care about the speed on the first wall frame, but rather the last wall run frame, which is n-1. The look and input direction, which are L hat and I hat, should also be sourced from this frame, since this is the actual frame that the jump input is actually sent on. Out of the parameters I collected data for, only one of them actually showed a correlation with this one. Here's the starting speed and the vertical and horizontal look directions. All of these are just a straight line. The vertical input direction is just a bunch of noise, but the horizontal input direction is where we can actually see a bit of what's going on. These are the individual components of the impulse applied to our velocity. This sine wave shows the component that's parallel to the wall, and this clipped cosine shows the component that's perpendicular to the wall. We can also map both of these components directly onto the x and y axes to get this stretched half circle, which we can think of as the shape that the impulse vector traces as we rotate our input direction. This shows us pretty intuitively where the biggest possible impulse lies, which is on these corners, 205 units away from the wall and 75 units parallel to the wall. To be even more specific, the optimal impulse is the corner of the shape that's on the same side that our velocity vector is pointing, as the opposite side would give us an impulse that would reduce our overall speed. And as it turns out, these corners also correspond to the input direction being directly in line with the wall. If the input happens to be neutral, so the Wishter vector is 0, 0, then the impulse is always 205 units in the direction of the wall normal. Now that we finally have a picture of the behavior of a wall kick, the last big step we need to take is to create a model for this behavior, a function if you will, and compare that against our original data. Let's do that by again going through each component individually as if we were building these mechanics from scratch to the weirdly specific requirements of some designer that's really into drawing graphs for some reason. Player wall collisions are usually the type of behavior that, once it's in place for a game or an engine, you don't really need to change it any further, which is why a lot of games tend to handle them in similar ways. The common end result that they all get to is that your velocity is aligned with the wall, and you lose some speed proportional to the angle at which you jumped at the wall. If you jump straight into a wall, you stop completely, and if you barely graze it as you're moving, you will preserve most of your speed. If you recall how I mentioned that the cosine shape our data showed is a big clue, this is what I was referring to. So knowing the shape we want to get to and knowing that the impulse is always in the direction of the wall normal, the only thing we need to do is figure out how big that impulse should be. And the way we do that is by taking the dot product between the player velocity and the wall normal. This effectively returns how much of the velocity is pointing into the wall. Though because the two vectors are pointing away from each other, we get a negative number, which we need to flip to get our impulse vector to point in the right direction. So the initial wall contact can really be described with just this one line. Now, onto the wall run. Listen, I'm gonna simplify here a lot, and I even have been throughout this entire video, but I'm just gonna say it explicitly here. We're definitely not describing the entirety of Titanfall's wall mechanics here, only a very small part that has special relevance within a speedrunning context. What we're looking to describe in particular is wall friction, which follows this curve. What we were already able to see is that when shifting the curves from different starting speeds horizontally, the curves overlap pretty much perfectly, which suggests that regardless of the starting speed or anything else really, every frame's velocity is calculated by subtracting some value from the previous frame's velocity. If we take two values from one curve, get the difference, and subtract that every frame, we get a straight line, which is actually not what we want. We want an expression where the subtracted value gets smaller as the velocity itself gets smaller. So we need to multiply by the velocity here. But now, to get to the same end result, this difference value instead needs to be the ratio between the value subtracted on this frame and the velocity, which is suspiciously close to 0.06 repeating. But running this expression for every frame finally gets us that same curve, but it's not fully there yet, because what if the game suddenly drops frames or the FPS starts going up? It's common practice for anything that you want to be consistent over time to multiply it by the frame time, or delta time as it's called in some engines. I know that I collected this data with the game running at 60 FPS, so if we multiply this value by 60 to fit in the frame time, yeah, that is probably about what that line looks like in the source code. The wall jump impulse, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated than a one-liner. We can use the fact that on a neutral input, the impulse goes in the direction of the wall normal with a length of 205 units as a starting point. This way we can think of the wall jump impulse as being composed of three vectors, one that goes away from the wall, one that goes forward, and one that goes inward. The big question we want to answer is, how do we get to this shape from our data using these three vectors? Well, let's just take it step by step. The 205 unit impulse away from the wall is always present no matter what, so we can already check off the first component with this line. The forward impulse is a little bit more complicated. We know from the data that this impulse that's in line with the wall is at most 75 units and follows this sine wave. It's tempting to just scale up the Wischter vector by 75 and slap that onto our velocity since that gives us the same sine wave, but this actually messes with our inward impulse, which we want to keep completely separate. So we want to flatten down the circle so the forward impulse is only on this line. A naive approach to do this might be to just take the x component and set it to 0, but since the wall could be facing in any direction, we need a more general solution, which is to use the wall normal. In fact, we can do this in the exact same way that we modeled the wall collision. We take the dot product between our Wischter and the wall normal and flip it so that when we multiply it by the wall normal, the vector we add always gets our Wischter to be parallel to the wall surface. And lastly, we just multiply the whole thing by the forward speed. For the inward component, we can thankfully use the wall normal as our base vector to scale up to the inward speed of 172 units multiplied by the Wischter wall normal dot product. This alone stretches our model shape in both directions, but if we just make sure this is only done when the Wischter points into the wall, then the outer half of the shape just gets clipped to 0. We're almost there now. The only thing now is that the shape of the inward component isn't quite right. Fixing this is unfortunately not at all apparent from just looking at it unless you happen to already know how to manipulate sine waves with math, but it's to simply square the dot product. Alright, we have our model, so now comes the moment of truth where we plug it into a visualizer and compare it against the initial data we collected. Let's plot the initial wall contact on the x-axis, wall friction on the y-axis, and show the speed delta on the z-axis. From here we can modulate the Wischter angle, which offsets the curve with this wavy pattern. This flat area down here is where the velocity reaches 0, and this single point up here shows the theoretical perfect wall kick. Perfectly flat angle and 0 frames spent on the wall. If we modulate the in-speed, we'll notice that the speed gain from a perfect wall kick slowly decreases, which makes sense since the wall jump impulse is never perfectly in line with the velocity, so as that increases, the off angle causes it to decrease in proportion. More crucially though, the in-speed affects the threshold at which you either gain or lose speed, which we can visualize as this cross-section where the delta is 0. Now, time to turn on our original data filtered by the incoming speed, and that's pretty damn close. There are of course still a few outliers here and there, so this model obviously isn't perfect, but for the purposes of getting a solid understanding of how wall kicks behave, I'd say this is more than good enough for me. So now it's time to get back to our question from before. What is the perfect wall kick? Well, that would be an incoming angle of 0 degrees, or 90 degrees from the wall normal, 0 wall frames, and a look and input direction perfectly in line with the wall. This minimizes the potential speed loss for each component. The incoming angle optimizes the initial wall contact, the timing ensures that we leave the wall on the first possible frame so that no wall friction is ever applied, and the input direction maximizes the scale of the wall jump impulse. So this maximizes the speed delta for every possible speed, but importantly, it's not the same speed boost every time. Since the impulse from the wall kick is not perfectly in line with the velocity vector, the overall speed gain decreases as we increase our initial velocity, drawing a shape that looks like this. At 0 starting velocity, we have the biggest speed increase of about 218 units, but in-game that looks like this, which I wouldn't necessarily consider a wall kick, so instead the perfect speed gain for a wall kick at 340 units is about 123, and approaches 75 units as the initial velocity goes towards infinity. We can visually intuit this by again thinking of the wall jump as its components, where the forward impulse stays constant as it's in line with the velocity, and the wall normal impulse at 90 degrees approaches 0. And that should conclude our investigation into the wall kick and leave no further questions open. Yeah, there's some more stuff, actually. Crouch kicks are the most well-known variant of regular wall kicks, and I even made a whole video about the history of their discovery and how they almost ruined the entire speedrun. In principle, crouch kicks are also the simplest variant because they work by quite literally just adding an extra impulse of 70 units in the direction of the wall normal to the already existing wall jump impulse. I've previously simplified this to be a flat 3 kmh increase in speed gain on a wall kick, but of course it's a little bit more complicated than that because as your speed increases, that 70 unit sideways impulse becomes smaller in relation and therefore results in a smaller speed delta. Does that make sense? Probably not. Anyway, this is still simplified to have a perfect Wischter angle, but the overall bonus from a crouch kick gradually decreases as our in-speed increases. Slope kicks are a relatively new addition to the wall kick family, and they're characterized by a higher speed gain from a wall kick off of a sloped wall when approaching it with a lot of downward momentum. This has everything to do with the initial wall contact, and we can actually explain this pretty simply with our understanding of how the game handles wall collisions. As we know, when colliding with a wall, the game adds a vector in the direction of the wall normal, scaled such that our new velocity is parallel to the wall. This is a fairly simple process when the wall is perfectly vertical and we only need to think about the X and Y components, but when the wall is angled upwards and we have a lot of downward speed, the Z component actually starts to play a role. In a simplified case, say we're falling straight down onto the wall. Computationally, we're not really doing anything different here. We add the wall normal, scaled by the dot product, yada yada, but in this context, we basically just converted some of our vertical velocity into horizontal velocity, which is a lot more useful as it can be actually built upon. Differently from vertical velocity, which can usually be discarded since any upward impulse is counteracted by gravity pulling us down, and any downward impulse is nullified by the ground stopping us. Even if we now add a forward component, that same principle holds true. The overall length of our clipped velocity vector might be smaller, but if we ignore the vertical component, it's actually larger than what we would get from a vertical wall with the same incoming velocity. And this effect only gets amplified with more and more downward speed. Banana peel kicks take advantage of a specific property of damage boosts that we call the banana peel timer, which temporarily sets your ground and wall friction values to 0. For wall friction, that's probably our 4 constant right here. The duration of the banana peel correlates linearly with the size of the impulse from the damage boost. 150 units is where it starts, and 320 units pairs with roughly half a second. After this duration, the friction value lerps back to its original value over the next half second. This effectively means that if we damage boost ourselves and immediately go for a wall kick, we can effectively get a free firstie where we lose no speed from wall friction, and the only thing we have to worry about is our incoming angle. Now, despite how deep it may look like I went here, I really only scratched the surface of Titanfall's wall mechanics. Like, just to give you a taste of what I left out, wall acceleration seems to follow this formula. At least that's a decent approximation, but there's this weird inflection point here where the acceleration starts to look different. The vertical component looks like this, and both together look like this. There's this upward impulse you get when you touch the wall that probably plays into this, but I don't know how.
There is supposed to be one line here. Why are there 2 lines? That's not supposed to be there. There's not supposed to be 2 lines here. This is the same thing, just like visualize. I don't what the hell is going on?
I mentioned that looking up or down changes the max wall run speed. Here's what that looks like for every possible angle. Notice this gap? Yeah, that's a range where for some reason the game just takes control of your camera and moves it without your permission, and I wish I could tell you why any of this behaves the way that it does, but unfortunately I can't. So I'll leave that for someone who's smart enough to use IDA or something.